In 1933, Stalin faced a problem. 2 million people had been labeled socially harmful: kulaks, political prisoners, religious believers, anyone the Soviet state considered disposable. The solution came from Genrikh Yagoda, head of the secret police. Resettle them in Siberia, build collective farms, and let them survive on their own, or not survive at all. In May, 5,000 of those people were taken to a remote island. No food, no shelter, no tools. What they had instead was something else, something they didn't yet recognize. A sentence that had already been decided. What followed there wasn't just collapse. It revealed something about how systems work when no one is expected to come back. Where are you watching from right now? And if you're new to Legacy of Fear, hit that subscribe button, because this story gets darker. The island was called Nazino, a stretch of frozen swamp in the middle of the Ob River, deep in Siberia, surrounded by thin trees, cold water, and a silence that didn't feel natural. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the kind that comes from emptiness, from a place where nothing grows unless it's forced to. On May 10th, 5,000 prisoners were brought there. They came from across the Soviet Union: kulaks, political prisoners, religious believers, and many who didn't clearly belong to any category at all. Some had committed minor infractions, others none that they understood. What they had in common was simple: the state had decided they were no longer necessary. No one explained where they were going, and by that point, most of them had already learned not to ask. Questions didn't bring clarity. They brought attention, and attention tended to shorten your life. There was, however, one small detail that stood out, something that didn't seem important at first but would later take on meaning. The guards had brought binoculars, several pairs. They remained on the barges, watching the island with a level of focus that didn't match a routine transfer. It wasn't supervision, it was observation, deliberate and patient, as if they were waiting for something to unfold. Kuzma Salnikov was 34 years old, a miner from Novokuznetsk. 6 weeks earlier, he had been arrested for forgetting his passport. In the Soviet Union, that wasn't treated as a mistake. It was interpreted as intent, a sign that you might be hiding something, that you might not be reliable, that you might not belong where you were. Kuzma hadn't been hiding anything, he had simply forgotten. But the system didn't operate on nuance, it operated on categories, and once a person was placed into one, the distinction between accident and guilt stopped mattering. The moment he stepped off the barge and onto the island, something felt wrong. No one needed to say it out loud. It was there in the distance the guards kept, in the fact that they did not follow onto the shore, in the way they watched, instead of directing. That kind of separation carried meaning, even if no one could yet explain it. The first night made it clear. 500 people died before morning, not through violence, not through execution, but through exposure. Their bodies, already weakened by transport and deprivation, couldn't endure the cold without shelter or fire. Some lay down thinking they would rest for a moment and never woke up. Others remained sitting where they had collapsed, as if frozen in the act of waiting. By sunrise, the ground was covered with bodies, and those who had survived were left with a problem they didn't know how to solve. They had no tools to dig, no authority to organize, and no instructions. The dead remained where they had fallen, while the living tried to understand the situation they had been placed in. On the second day, the guards threw bread into the crowd. There wasn't enough, not even close, and the way it was distributed made that clear immediately. Instead of order, there was a surge of bodies, people pushing forward, grabbing, falling, struggling to hold on to whatever they could reach. The strongest took what they could, the weaker were pushed aside, and some never got back up at all. From the barges, the guards watched the scene unfold with a kind of detached curiosity, as if what they were seeing confirmed something they had already expected. Kuzma stayed back. During his weeks in custody, he had learned that desperation made people visible, and visibility made them vulnerable. Instead of joining the struggle, he observed. He watched the guards drinking and laughing, insulated from the island by distance and by choice. He watched the bodies beginning to accumulate along the shore. He watched the absence of any attempt to intervene, organize, or correct what was happening. And gradually, something else became clear. The guards were not simply ignoring the situation. They were studying it. By the third day, the nature of the place began to reveal itself. This wasn't a labor camp. Labor camps had structure, schedules, systems that turned suffering into function. There was always a purpose, even if it was brutal. Here there was nothing of the sort. No organization, no tools, no expectation of survival. People had been placed in an environment where survival depended entirely on what they could take, endure, or improvise, and no one seemed interested in helping them do any of those things. That night, Kuzma made a decision. He waited until the guards on the barges were drunk, their attention dulled, their movements slower, their vigilance reduced to something closer to routine than control. Then he walked into the river. The water was freezing, the kind of cold that first shocks the body, then numbs it, then begins to shut it down entirely. He moved carefully, keeping low, staying parallel to the shore before angling toward the opposite bank. The current pulled harder than he expected, and more than once he felt his strength slipping, his body beginning to fail. But something deeper than conscious thought kept him moving, a kind of instinct that overrides calculation when stopping is no longer an option. He reached the far side, pulled himself onto the bank, and kept going. He didn't know where he was headed, didn't have a plan beyond putting distance between himself and the island. But that was enough. By the time the guards realized someone was missing, Kuzma had already disappeared into the Siberian forest. He would survive. He would spend the rest of his life working quietly, saying nothing about what he had seen. But survival didn't mean escape in the way people imagine it. The island didn't stay behind. It stayed with him, not as a place but as a memory that never resolved. A knowledge that couldn't be shared, and a question that never fully left him. Why he had made it out, and so many others had not. Back on Nazino, nothing changed. People continued to die, the guards continued to watch, and somewhere beyond the river, inside the structure that had sent them there, someone was documenting what was happening, not as a failure, but as a result. On the fourth day, the guards announced a change that, at first glance, seemed like organization. There would be no more individual distributions. Anyone who wanted flour would have to form brigades, groups of roughly 150 people, each led by a chosen representative. That leader would receive the entire allocation and be responsible for dividing it among the group. It sounded administrative, almost reasonable. But on that island, structure didn't create fairness. It created control. Among the prisoners were men who understood immediately what this meant. Not farmers or laborers, but criminals, individuals already familiar with systems where power was taken, not assigned. They saw the opportunity before anyone else did. Leadership meant access to food, and access to food meant survival. Everything else followed from that. They stepped forward as organizers, stronger, louder, more assertive than those around them. They filled the vacuum the guards had deliberately left behind. The guards, watching from their barges, handed over the sacks of flour without hesitation and withdrew once again into distance and alcohol. By nightfall, the island had a hierarchy, but it had nothing to do with fairness, merit, or need. Those who controlled the brigades kept most of the flour for themselves. What remained was distributed according to rules that shifted constantly, depending on loyalty, intimidation, or convenience. Anyone who questioned it was beaten. Anyone who tried to appeal to the guards was ignored. And by then, most of the guards were too drunk to intervene, even if they had wanted to. Vodka had arrived in quantities large enough to suggest this had never been intended as a short operation. The guards spent their days drinking, watching, and occasionally interacting with the island in ways that made it clear they no longer saw it as something to manage. It had become something else, something that no longer required their involvement. Some of them treated it as entertainment. One guard developed the habit of bringing the boat close to shore during food distributions and throwing pieces of bread into the crowd rather than handing them out. From the safety of the barge, he watched the reaction. The sudden movement, the collisions, the desperate attempts to grab something before it disappeared. He repeated this more than once. No one stopped him. Another preferred a different kind of control. He would select prisoners to row him across the river on small errands. If he decided the effort wasn't satisfactory, too slow, uneven, or simply not to his liking, he would push the rower into the water. The Ob River, even in May, was cold enough to kill quickly, especially for someone already weakened. He watched them disappear beneath the surface, then chose another without hesitation. The others saw it happen. No one intervened. On the island, the internal structure continued to evolve. The men controlling the brigades began to need more than food. They needed leverage, something they could exchange with the guards. Gold teeth became that currency. Small, dense, and easily traded, they quickly gained value. Guards exchanged bread, cigarettes, and small privileges for them, and the prisoners adapted to that logic without needing instruction. At night, groups moved through the island searching for those who still had gold in their mouths. They used stones, not tools, and worked with efficiency. It wasn't chaotic violence. It followed a pattern. At the same time, disease spread through the population. The river served as drinking water, washing source, and disposal site for the dead. Dysentery followed. Those who had survived the cold and the first days of starvation now faced something slower, less visible, but just as lethal. Death became constant, no longer tied to a specific moment or event. The bodies accumulated faster than anyone could move them. On the fifth day, a group of prisoners attempted something that might have been called resistance under different circumstances. Thousands of voices raised together, demanding food, tools, and some acknowledgement that the situation could be changed. The sound carried across the water to the barges. The guards came ashore. They listened for a moment, then announced that distribution would continue, but only through the brigade system already in place. Nothing would change. They returned to the barges. At night, some guards crossed the river for a different reason. They approached women with offers, food, protection, slightly better conditions, in exchange for compliance. For those who had spent days watching people die around them, who had nothing left to trade except their bodies, it wasn't a choice in any meaningful sense. Some returned with food, some didn't return at all. One guard, later identified in testimonies, had taken a particular interest in a young woman from the first transport. He kept her on the barge, giving her food and a degree of protection. According to witnesses, he told her that on that river he was Stalin, that her survival depended on him in the same way everyone's depended on the state. By the end of the second week, the island had developed its own geography of danger. Certain areas near the tree line were avoided after dark. Certain groups moved at night with a purpose that had nothing to do with warmth or shelter. Those who had survived long enough began to recognize these patterns, not because they could change them, but because recognizing them increased their chances of lasting one more day. On May 25th, a second barge arrived, carrying 1,500 additional prisoners. From the water, the island didn't immediately reveal what it had become. There were fires. There was movement. It could be mistaken for a camp in early formation. What couldn't be seen from a distance, what the smell should have made clear before anyone stepped ashore, was what lay beneath the surface. What the ground had become. What the fires were sometimes burning. The prisoners who had already been there watched the new arrivals closely. That night, several of them disappeared. The doctor assigned to the island had been documenting deaths from the beginning, recording cause, approximate age, and physical condition with a level of consistency that went beyond routine procedure. In an environment where almost nothing could be controlled, writing things down became the only way to impose some kind of order on what he was witnessing. Around the 10th day, while examining a group of bodies that had been brought to him, he noticed details that did not align with the pattern he had been observing. The injuries were not consistent with exposure, disease, or the kind of violence that emerged from hunger and desperation. These were cuts, deliberate, placed with intention, and repeated across multiple bodies in similar locations such as the thighs, calves, and upper arms. The consistency suggested method rather than chaos. He documented everything carefully and sent a report to Tomsk, expecting that the nature of what he had found would require attention. The response, when it arrived 3 days later, was brief and dismissive. The prisoners were described as degenerate elements, prone to abnormal and violent behavior, and no further action was deemed necessary. He was instructed to continue his documentation and not escalate the issue again. He followed those instructions in the only way he could, which was to keep writing. On May 21st, 70 deaths were recorded within a single day, and among them, several displayed the same pattern of cuts. In the days that followed, the number increased and the wounds became more precise, suggesting that whoever was responsible was not only continuing, but refining the process. The doctor began to understand that what he was observing was not random violence, but something more controlled, something that had developed its own internal logic. The notebook became something he guarded closely. He kept it with him at all times, even while sleeping, positioning it beneath his body as a precaution against theft or loss. By that point, it was no longer just a record of deaths. It had become the only structured account of what was happening on the island. As the 3rd week approached, the pattern could no longer be dismissed. The injuries were too consistent, too deliberate, and too frequent to be explained by individual acts of desperation. When he attempted to raise the issue again, the response from the guards remained unchanged. They repeated the same explanation, framing the prisoners as inherently violent and the situation as self-regulating, removing any need for intervention. The system within the island continued to evolve. The men who controlled the brigades adapted quickly, extending their control beyond food distribution. Bodies were no longer treated equally. Those that were recent and not yet affected by disease were handled differently, selected with a level of intention that suggested emerging organization. What remained was left in place, contributing to an environment where death became both constant and normalized. On May 29th, a man was brought to the doctor who was still alive but severely injured. The nature of his wounds made it immediately clear that the process he had been documenting involved not only method but control over timing. The injuries indicated that the man had been kept alive during what had been done to him. The doctor examined him, recorded the details, and waited for some form of explanation. But none came. The man died without speaking. That night, the doctor decided to attempt communication outside the official channels that had already failed him. He approached a guard named Mikhail, who had, in subtle ways, shown signs of awareness that distinguished him from the others. The doctor did not describe what he had seen in detail. Instead, he asked whether it was possible to send a message beyond the island. Mikhail's response reframed everything. He explained carefully and without elaboration that the authorities were already aware of the conditions. The starvation, the violence, and the deaths were not unknown variables. They were accepted outcomes. The island was functioning in a way that aligned with its purpose, removing individuals the system had already deemed expendable without requiring additional intervention. When the doctor pressed for confirmation, Mikhail avoided direct statements, but made the implication clear enough. He advised him to stop writing, explaining that records were the only thing that could create consequences. Without documentation, there was nothing to investigate, and without investigation, there was no accountability. The doctor continued documenting. By early June, the population had been reduced by more than half. What had begun with 5,000 people had dropped to fewer than 2,000, and the process that had caused that reduction no longer appeared chaotic. It had stabilized into something that sustained itself without direct management. The guards remained present, but increasingly detached, spending most of their time on the barges, observing rather than intervening. What existed on the island at that point was a closed system, operating according to internal rules that no longer required external enforcement. On June 5th, a transport arrived from Tomsk, carrying officials rather than prisoners, marking a shift in the type of attention the island was receiving. These men approached the situation with a level of detachment that made their purpose clear from the beginning. They were not there to respond to what had happened, but to assess it. Dressed in formal clothing despite the conditions, they moved through the island methodically, observing without interruption and recording what they saw with precision. They examined the areas near the river where bodies had accumulated, studied the arrangement of the camp, and took note of the fires and the way they were being used. Their focus was selective and deliberate, directed toward measurable aspects rather than human impact. They spoke with the men controlling the brigades, asking about mortality rates, distribution systems, and the organization of resources. The answers were given without resistance, and the information was written down without visible reaction. There was no attempt to question the legitimacy of what had developed, only to understand how it functioned. The doctor, despite having maintained detailed records, was not consulted, and his documentation was neither requested nor acknowledged. Whatever value his observations held did not align with the purpose of the visit. After completing their inspection, the officials departed, taking with them only what they had recorded. Their presence did not alter the conditions on the island, but it confirmed something that had already been implied. What had taken place there was not outside the awareness of the system. Shortly after their departure, the guards announced that the island would be evacuated. The remaining prisoners were to be transported to labor camps in other regions, bringing an end to the process that had been unfolding. The evacuation occurred over several days. Those still capable of walking were loaded onto barges and taken away, while those who were too weak, too ill, or unable to move were left behind without any clear indication of what would happen to them. No formal record accounts for their fate. The doctor remained only briefly before being transferred. There was no investigation into his role, no questioning regarding what he had witnessed, and no acknowledgement that his documentation had any significance. His relocation was handled in the same manner as any other logistical movement within the system. He kept the notebook. It remained hidden, never shared, and never mentioned, preserved as the only account he controlled, untouched by the processes that had shaped every other version of events. The island itself was abandoned. Without the constant presence of prisoners, guards, and activity, the structures that had formed began to deteriorate. The fires burned out, the makeshift organization dissolved, and what remained was left to decay without intervention. The system that had created the island, however, did not end with it. The individuals involved were redistributed, absorbed into other parts of the structure, or removed entirely, but the underlying logic persisted, continuing to operate in different forms and locations. Years later, when archives were opened, the doctor's notebook was discovered among materials that had remained sealed for decades. Its contents provided a detailed account of what had taken place, offering a level of clarity that had not existed within the official record. The island was never formally acknowledged within the official records of the Soviet state, and no direct reference to its existence appeared in reports, statistics, or historical accounts produced at the time. Its absence from documentation ensured that, within the structure of the system that created it, the event itself could be treated as if it had never occurred. The survivors were dispersed across labor camps throughout the Soviet Union in a manner that prevented any unified account from forming. By separating them geographically and administratively, the system ensured that their experiences remained isolated, fragmented, and difficult to verify collectively. Many did not survive long after leaving the island, succumbing to the conditions of the camps in the months and years that followed. Those who did survive encountered a different form of erasure, one that relied not on physical conditions, but on silence. Speaking about what had happened carried risks that most were unwilling to take, particularly in an environment where such claims could be interpreted as accusations against the state. As a result, most accounts were never shared. The men who had controlled the brigades were processed in various ways. Some were executed, though not specifically for their actions on the island. Others were reassigned, continuing to function within the system under different circumstances. A number disappeared entirely, their identities and roles absorbed into the broader structure. The guards were also reassigned, their involvement neither formally examined nor publicly addressed. Some received recognition for their service, while others were quietly relocated. Their actions, like the island itself, were not incorporated into any official narrative. Genrikh Yagoda, who had proposed the broader resettlement policies that led to the creation of such operations, did not witness the full consequences of what had been set in motion. The system extended beyond individual oversight, developing into something that functioned independently of its original design. In 1937, during the Great Purge, he was arrested, accused, and eventually executed in 1938 after being forced to confess to crimes unrelated to the island. His fate reflected the same mechanism he had helped establish, in which individuals could be removed once they were no longer useful. The doctor preserved his notebook in silence for decades, continuing his work in other locations without discussing what he had documented. After his death, the notebook was passed on and eventually stored in archives that remained closed until the collapse of the Soviet Union. When those archives were opened in 1991, the notebook was among the materials examined by researchers. Its contents were verified and later published, providing one of the few detailed accounts of the events that had taken place. By that time, most of those directly involved were no longer alive, and the system responsible for the island had already ceased to exist in its original form. Kuzma Salnikov survived and lived the remainder of his life in Siberia, working in mining and maintaining a silence similar to that of the doctor. He did not speak about the island, and those around him remained unaware of his experience. He died in the 1980s, leaving no recorded account of what he had seen. The island itself was left to deteriorate without investigation or recovery efforts. The bodies were never systematically removed, and the site was not fully examined. Over time, natural processes altered the landscape, eliminating visible traces of what had occurred. When researchers eventually visited the location, there was little physical evidence remaining. What persisted was the record. The notebook did not offer interpretation or justification. It did not attempt to explain the events beyond what had been observed. It existed as a detailed account of actions, conditions, and outcomes, preserved outside the official system that had allowed them to occur. Cannibal Island is often described as a story about brutality, but that description is too simple. What happened there did not come from chaos or loss of control. It emerged from a system that had already decided certain people no longer mattered, and once that decision was in place, everything that followed became possible. The island itself is gone. The structures that sustained it no longer exist in any visible form. What remains is harder to confront. The logic behind it, the idea that under specific conditions, entire groups can be reduced to something expendable, without resistance from the system that defines them. The only reason any of this is known at all is because one person chose to document it. The notebook does not argue, interpret, or attempt to justify what happened. It simply records it, and in doing so, it prevents the complete disappearance of those events. That alone is enough to make it matter. If this story left an impression on you, whether through the events themselves or what they suggest about how systems operate, consider subscribing. There are other cases that follow a similar pattern, where the most disturbing part is not what happened, but how easily it was allowed to happen. I'd also like to hear your perspective. I'll see you in the next investigation.